All right, on page 77, I believe it is, of the notes. That's where we start today, at the bottom of the page. So we are talking about the constant source of trouble that is the East. In this case, we're talking about, we were emphasizing the fact that the Pope was clearly recognized at this time in the 5th century that the Pope must be the one to confirm that any particular bishop is in fact the bishop of a diocese. However, his nomination is made, and there are various different forms that a nomination can take. As the Pope may or may not consider the wishes of people who may not agree to consider wishes coming from various different parties concerning who should be the bishop of a place. Something going on there? No. Okay. All right. He can consider that if he chooses to, but he need not. Definitely not. And any such consideration is purely by way of concession. And sometimes that can be suddenly withdrawn, any such agreement. There are various examples in the history of the Church of concordats, agreements having been reached between the Holy See and various civil governments. But because of misbehavior on the part of the state, and it's always misbehavior on the part of the state, that's where the trouble always comes from. The Church is reasonable in every instance. Certainly, as the Church, as officials of the Church, the popes have always acted reasonably, and it's always the civil power that I can't even think of a single instance of wrongdoing on the part of a pope that starts a trouble. It's always the civil power acting up in some way. But whenever the civil power acts up, or sometimes when the civil power acts up, the Church can say, no, we're pulling out of the concordat. That is now canceled. And so concordats may include such concessions as we're willing to respect the veto of the civil power with regard to the choice of a bishop in a particular place, or we might not. We might accept the list of nominations, choose someone from the list of nominees provided by the king, the emperor, whoever. But it's always by way of concession. Always by, okay, we'll do that. We'll take that into consideration every time. We'll agree to do that in response for not conscripting the clergy into the army, or no extra taxes on the church, or allowing the Catholic Church, the church to operate unhindered, something like that. It's usually for something pretty basic, some concession that's made for something very basic in return, all for the good of souls. But sometimes the Pope includes that this is the desired effect is no longer being achieved, so we are no longer going to abide by those guidelines. St. Pius X did that at a certain point. The French Third Republic was so thoroughly horrible and rotten, and they were just so bad. He concluded at a certain point that all we could do is pull out of our concordat with them, and he concluded, I will consecrate the bishops myself and send them into France, which he did. And that made the French Third Republic unhappy, but we're talking about a bunch of thoroughly rotten Freemasons, so there's no surprise there. And so he decided there's the only way we'll ever get good bishops in France. The only way that we will be able to provide for the good of souls there is to send in our own choices for bishops. So he did indeed, and he can do that. There was absolutely no injustice done, certainly when we know, on the part of St. Pius X, who's now canonized, but we could just tell from the general rules that there is no injustice done by the Pope there, because the state has absolutely can make no such demands on the Church. Has no right whatsoever to make any such demands on things of such ecclesiastical importance as who the bishop of a diocese is. So it's true that the bishop of a diocese is more than simply an agent of the Pope in the diocese, but still his authority, it seems, it would be hard to argue with that now, his authority comes through the Pope, and certainly he must be confirmed by the Pope. So no one is a bishop of a diocese without the approval of the Vicar of Christ on earth. That we can say, certainly. Whatever the theory behind it, that we can say with certitude. So, it's at this time that the Pope is willing to consider nominations from locals in the place where the bishop is going to rule. And we pointed out last time we find a council and a full council asking the Pope's approval of an episcopal election carried on canonically and without opposition. So according to the canonical rules, the canon law of the time. And though this John Toliah, remember he was the one who was elected, had been consecrated immediately after his election, still his authority needed to be confirmed by the approval of the Holy See. St. Simplicius formally opposed the restoration of Peter Mongus, Peter the Stutterer, to the Patriarchal See of Alexandria. Moving on from there, though we saw that the Emperor Zeno began to get a little big for his britches, as they say, and decided to get involved, solacing himself, flattering himself, we might say, with the hope of settling religious disputes. And that while he himself proved utterly unable to maintain peace in his own court, he thought himself called to heal by a word dissensions which were altogether out of his province. And this is why he put out this edict known as the Henoticon, the Formula of Union, published into the influence of such ideas. We are entreated on all hands, he says, whether with that seems highly unlikely to be true, but that's what he says, to effect a union of the churches and to remedy the fatal effects of their division. So churches meaning different parts of the church, different areas within the Catholic Church. So that's what he sees himself as called upon to do. Why? It's not entirely clear. Just might be his own big head. For a vast number of persons have thus been deprived of the benefits of baptism and communion. Blood has even been shed in the domestic strife. Who would not wish to see the end of such a state of things? Well, if that description of things is true, absolutely yes. But he is not the one to do it. It's outside of his province, as Darras puts it. That's outside of his realm of influence, so as it should be. That's not his job. He has no authority over such things. Yes, he is to assist the church in achieving those ends, but that's not for him to take care of most immediately. We have therefore determined to make a solemn profession of our faith in the presence of the whole world. We proclaim that we have never held and never will hold any other profession or teaching, any other definition of faith than that of the 318 Fathers of Nice, confirmed by the 150 of Constantinople. Whoever holds any other is rejected from our communion, for this profession alone is the hope of our empire. In this profession alone, all nations are baptized. It is the profession followed at Ephesus by the Fathers, who deposed the impious Nestorius and his partisans. With them we also anathematize the heresiarch and condemn Eutyches. Their sentiments were opposed to those of the bishops assembled in those great councils. We admit as a true exposition of faith the 12 chapters of St. Cyril of Alexandria, so on and so forth. He goes on to, seems to put down, we have to examine every little thing that he says, but it seems he is putting forth statements that are orthodox. Let's see, moving on. So those are the most important passages of the Henoticon. So the confusion, it's less aspects of faith that are a problem here. It seems to be orthodox. To examine every little thing to see if there's anything wrong. But confusion, incoherence, contradiction, abuse of power are the prominent features presented by the first reading of the edict. So it's that he's overstepping his bounds. Confusion of power here. Yes, keep in mind that at the time it was clearly understood that the civil power is most definitely supposed to be involved in the preaching of the faith in some way. It used to even be, so I've heard that the King of France would during High Mass would put on a dalmatic and sing the gospel. May have even been a deacon, may have received the order of deacon for the purpose of doing that. But the idea was that this is what I've been told, that that was done because it was nobody found that strange, because it seems strange to us, even understanding what the correct order of things should be now, but that might seem strange. But the idea was that the civil power is definitely to be involved in the preaching of the gospel. The faith is it was clearly understood that where both the church and the state deal with souls, immortal souls. It's not as though the state cannot forget that it is ruling over individuals with families, more importantly, made up of individuals with immortal souls. that cannot be forgotten. The state must never forget that. And what good really is of what use is the state, even if it does a magnificent job of providing for the temporal interests of its citizens, if after leaving this earth they all go straight to hell? What is the point? The answer is there is none. The purpose of the state is to provide for the temporal interests of its citizens so that they, as members of the church, can more easily provide for their eternal welfare. That is the purpose of the state. That was understood. So it was clearly understood at a time such as what we're looking at now in the 5th century, that the civil power has rightly has the very keenest interest in providing for matters of faith at every level. Even on a low level, such as just holding the state together, relatively low. That's in itself very important. But even on a relatively low level, just maintaining order in the state, that's necessary. Because without religious unity, there will never be national unity. Those are the most important matters. If you're going to have unity and agreement on all the most important matters, why would there ever be agreement on anything lesser? Perhaps another way to look at it, those are the most basic points upon which unity must be based. All national unity must be based. If you don't have such unity on such basic things, why would you have unity on anything else? Anything that must be founded upon that. So there was much more, in other words, there was much more common sense at the time than there is now. Now everybody preaching religious liberty, freedom, of this, that, and the other thing. That's laying the seeds, not just the seeds. That's planting a bomb at the foundation of the edifice that you profess that you want to uphold. It's filling it with holes, planting explosives in it, setting it up for destruction, total collapse, obliteration. To have to found your nation on those ideas. It's no surprise that we see the Western civilization absolutely crumbling the way it is. No surprise at all. It was either nations during the period of the Enlightenment, or by the principles that were born during the period of the Enlightenment. Either new nations were founded on those ideas, the United States first among them, and from which all others founded on those principles take their frame of reference, and their inspiration, if you want to put it that way. Or the formerly Catholic nations of Western Europe, that might still be Catholic culturally to some degree, got rid of the solid principles, faith on which they had been founded, and replaced them with the principles of the Enlightenment. So it's really no surprise at all that you just had this disintegration of Western civilization, according to every aspect. The fact of the matter is, you get rid of the faith, everything else will fall apart too. That was very much the idea of the Enlightenment. We don't need the faith. Man could just be good all on his own, just by natural reason, etc. It was all this. It's just tremendous pride, extolling reason. Everything was reason. Well, the fact of the matter is, it's utterly unreasonable to reject the faith. So the emperor in this case is in a situation where such insanity, and as Pope Gregory XVI, Pope Gregory XVI condemned religious liberty as the notion of religious freedom as insanity, which it is, for all the reasons we've just enunciated. He's working at a time when those ideas, those insanities, are not so widespread. In fact, anybody at the time would have considered that insanity. The pagan Romans would have considered that insanity. They had more common sense than that. But even so, even in a situation where their people, generally speaking, have a better idea of the way things should be, there are still going to be problems, because fallen human nature is still fallen human nature. There are people who will still make mistakes. People will still confuse things. People will still go to excess or fail by way of defect. And in this case, the emperor is confusing two distinct things. The power of the church, the church and the state must be one in the sense of, certainly one in the purpose that they pursue, which is ultimately the eternal welfare of the people over whom both entities rule. But they are still two distinct entities. The church is not the state, and the state is not the church. They are still two separate entities, even if they must be united in purpose and their goal, and pursue those ends in unison with cooperation. They must be truly united in that sense. Still, they are two distinct things, each with separate. Certain things fall into the sphere of one. Certain things fall into the sphere of the other. You can picture a Venn diagram. There most definitely is a great deal of overlap in things that they have to deal with. The people with whom they deal, for one thing. And in many areas, they do have to cooperate. But there are certain things that fall completely under the purview of one and completely under the purview of the other. I mean, the Pope will not dictate to a civil government how to take care of their roads, for example. If they're being negligent in that way and it's causing a lot of problems, you might exhort them, you should do something about your roads. But he's not going to start dictating to them whom to appoint to oversee the roads, for example. So the state has no right to demand, definitely not, who should be the bishop of this or that diocese. Now, the Pope would not presume to write the laws for the civil power. Here are the laws you must employ in your country. So the state certainly has no right to dictate to the church what professions of faith should be formulated. The emperor is confusing. That's a real problem here, is confusing two essentially distinct things. Doubtless, the Nicene Creed was then as now the expression of the Catholic faith, but it was, he says, not the only expression of the faith, since the bishops from all parts of the world met together at Chalcedon, had published a definition of faith, more detailed, more extensive at some points than that of Nicaea, and the Catholic world had adopted the profession of Chalcedon. So there is no contradiction amongst any of these. Nicene Creed is still sung at Mass to this day, but there are other professions of faith which the church can approve of and has in fact approved of. And this is what we might call, in a good sense, and we stress that in a good sense, development of doctrine. Modernists say that, mean that in a different sense. In a true sense, the development of doctrine is exactly this: the more detailed, more extensive professions of faith that are formulated over time to meet new problems that arise. Nothing changing in itself to the positive faith. The public revelation is fixed, is done, but it can still be explained more clearly. So you can have we've used this example before, multiple photographs of the same object, but some taken with a higher quality camera, or even after that, the film might be better developed. You can have a less or better developed piece of film. Not getting back to film cameras. You can have a less or better developed piece of film that is presented. Even digital things, you can choose different settings. There are different levels of digital definition in which you want to view something. A photograph, for example. So also the professions of faith, dogmatic formulas, and so forth in the church can be in a sense set at a higher or lower level of definition according to what needs to be seen. One section of all of it, though, regarding the same object, the positive faith, the same deposit of divine revelation. You might even, in some cases, need to put a certain portion of that photograph under a microscope. Some controversy rises on some very particular point. The church can zoom in on that and draw all of that out as clearly as possible. If it's truly contained in divine revelation, either implicitly or explicitly, then it is subject to an infallible definition of the church. And even if not, the church is still is the one to decide whether a truth that is, as we say, virtually contained in divine revelation, either explicitly or implicitly, but reasoning from things that are contained in divine revelation, must necessarily be true. That's called being virtually revealed. For example, the existence of limbo of the infants. It seems to be a good example of a truth that is virtually contained in divine revelation. One which you might not be able to find that anywhere explicitly or implicitly in divine revelation, but given everything that we know to be contained in it, that must be true. That must exist. The limbo of the infants must exist. If you deny that, then you are unavoidably committed, if you're consistent, to denying truths of the faith. So that's just one example. But the point being that all of that is under the purview of the church, as for the church to guard and protect and oversee. And the state is not to say, once again, that the state is not to be involved, but it must not overstep its bounds. So the emperor in this case is unwilling to receive the counsel of Chalcedon, and yet he opposes Eutyches by a definition which is substantially that of Chalcedon. Could incoherence and contradiction be more glaring? What else can we behold in the prince who wields a dogmatic pen with the hand that should have been more fitly armed to drive back the barbarian invader from his bounds than a usurper of the spiritual power, the leader of all the crowned heads who have tried to stretch the scepter of their temporal power over the domain of conscience and of faith? Who was Zeno that he should say to the world, this truth you shall believe, and that error you must reject? So, that, the way Darius puts this, is not, I'd say, not the best way, because certainly the civil power may say that, but having been directed by the church to say it, and how to say it, when to say it, at whom to direct it, and so forth. And so really in support of the church. So while the emperor, by his pretended diet of union, so diet in the sense of a meeting, furnished fresh materials to the spirit of discord and dissension, while that's going on, Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, of the royal line of the Amali, former Zeno's ally, turned his arms against him and besieged him in Constantinople. So he was busy formulating this Henoticon and imposing it. He should have been doing his main job, which was taking care of his more immediate responsibilities anyway. At that moment, more immediate, at any rate, the responsibility of protecting his borders. So, we need to go through all of the details of what he gives next, but the point here is that Zeno finally triumphed over his rivals rather by treason than through skill or courage. Something you'll see continuing in the East. The gravity of political events did not for a moment interfere with his religious cares. The Henoticon was published in all the cities of the empire and made public law. An order was sent to Alexandria to banish John Talia from the patriarchal throne and to give his place to Peter Mungus, so further troubles. The intruder now reappeared with a thirst for revenge. The Orthodox bishops and priests of Alexandria were maltreated and driven from their sees. Names of the Catholic patriarchs were removed from the sacred diptychs and replaced by those of Dioscorus and Timothy Aelurus. So notice the importance of that, how much importance is attached to that. Who is in the diptychs, whose names are to be pronounced during the sacred liturgy. That is of importance. And not just simply prayed for, because that's sometimes one objection that people raise when you say, oh, you cannot put the name of a pretender to the papacy, a false claimant to the papacy, in the canon of the Mass. Sometimes it's like that, oh, we're just praying for him. Some might say that is the gist of the prayer in the canon of the Mass, and that'd be one opinion. But even so, even if you go with that, it's praying for him as Pope. Not just as any person, not some sinner or somebody who is the worst perpetrator of a false religion and doing harm, the number one offender and doing harm to souls. But it's praying for him as Pope. Even if you go with that, and that's sometimes you might read one author who says that. To keep in mind, that might just be that author's take on that. Others might say, no, it's different from that. We're not entering into that right now. But just keep that in mind, that we're talking here about who are to be prayed for as the patriarchs, as the bishops, the legitimate bishops of this or that place. That is of high importance. So Peter Mungus carried his resentment yet further. He caused the body of Timothy Solophaciolus, which had, according to the usual custom, been buried in the Cathedral of Alexandria, to be disinterred and thrown into a desert place outside the city, so without the walls, outside the walls of the city. Meanwhile, the heretic had sent synodal letters to Pope Simplicius, begging him to confirm his authority, but the pontiff was far from ratifying such a usurpation. While the intruder was thus harassing the Church of Alexandria, the hireling who despoils the flock, John Talia, the intruder was the hireling, John Talia, appealed to the Apostolic See, Here he found help and protection. St. Simplicius wrote a most energetic letter to Acacius of Constantinople. Remember, the one who turned bad. He seemed to have been good earlier, but he turned bad. Definitely, at least either turned or showed his true colors after a certain point. He upbraided him with having contemned, so having held in contempt. That's a word you don't see too much. To contemn something, to despise it, disregard it, throw it aside. The orders of the Holy See. He upbraided him for that. He also brought about the restoration of Peter Mongus, that this Acacius did, brought back the intruder, the usurper, and caused the deposition of the rightful patriarch Gentilia, notwithstanding his, Gentilia's, innocence. So there's a certain level of, we'll say, there are certain ways for a once illegitimate civil ruler to come into legitimate power. The bar for that is not too high. You can, after overthrowing a legitimate government and a revolution, which was, in principle, that's a grave sin against the fourth commandment, to overthrow a legitimate authority, civil power, throw the state into upheaval and set oneself up as the power. That is serious disturbance of overthrowing rejection of the authority of those who are in fact invested by God with authority, and that is also a serious disturbance to the common good. But once that has been done and the new power installed, then once everything is under control, then that civil power is new power. It does not work that way in the church. No intruder into a see can become legitimate just by, okay, now he has everything under control and things are going his way. He might even be teaching the faith, but that does not make him legitimate. He needs papal confirmation. Nobody in the church has any position whatsoever that the Pope does not approve of. He definitely does not want, not saying that's even the case here, things have come under control, but there's no hope for as long as the Pope says he is not the bishop of this see, then he will not be. So Acacius replied that he did not deem Gentilia a legitimate patriarch, and that he had thought himself justified in communicating with Peter Mongus since he had signed the Henoticon. And Plicius retorted that the Henoticon was of no force, that no one could be orthodox who rejected the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon. In fine, that Peter Mongus had been condemned as a heretic by the Holy See, that he could be freed from the condemnation only by the same authority. Such was the embarrassed state of affairs in the East when St. Simplicius died on March 2nd of 483. So coming up right on the anniversary of his death at this point. So, whether or not there was anything, it seems there was nothing explicitly heretical no one heretical statement, perhaps in the Henoticon, it seems, but it was published by way of rejecting the Council of Chalcedon, and whoever, of course, rejects any council of the church is indeed cannot be characterized as orthodox. Absolutely not. And so, in any case, it's a case he says he doesn't consider. I don't consider him legitimate. I don't think he's worthy of it. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter the opinion of anyone else in the entire church, of anybody else, however good or bad he may be. If the Pope says he is not a bishop, he is not. If the Pope says he is, then he is. And by this, of course, we're referring to the power, the episcopal power of jurisdiction. Someone could be consecrated a bishop without the Pope's approval, and that could still be valid. Gravely illicit, in principle, but valid. And the Pope cannot reverse that. He can make it so that legally, he can make it so that it had, legally speaking, never occurred, but he cannot reverse the indelible mark on the soul that, well, depending on who you ask, either is imprinted or is the character of the priesthood amplified, so to speak, matured and made to grow in the soul, by way of analogy to physical things. That is conferred or increased, however you want to describe it, by episcopal consecration. The Pope cannot reverse that, but he can make it so that, legally speaking, that never occurred. That is within the power of the church. The church can also make it so that, say, a marriage that was invalidly contracted, it was an attempt to contract a marriage, was invalid, then later on validated, the church can make it so that, legally speaking, that was valid from the first attempt to contract it. That was not, in fact, the case. Nothing can change the fact that at 1 year ago, or whatever the span of time may be, that marriage was invalid. in fact. Nothing can change that. If the spouses or supposed spouses sinned, knowing that they were not in good faith and they were sinning and living in that relationship, up to the point of the validation of the marriage, then they are still guilty of sin. They still have to receive absolution for that. They still have to do penance for it. It still might be temporal punishment due to sin as a result of that. But the church can make us so that that marriage was validated at that point, actually in time, and then prior to that, legally speaking, was always valid. So, in other words, any children born to them before the validation of the marriage would be considered legitimate. That none of their sons, for example, would need to receive dispensation from the impediment of having been born illegitimately to pursue the priesthood, or if he should ever get to that point, become a bishop. The law of the church would not consider him ever to have been an illegitimate child. So, the church can do such things, which means that something can be true in reality, so to speak. Not to say that the law is not real, not to exclude the legal order from reality, but something can be real in fact, true in fact, but not recognized by law, or something can be legally so, but the law, that legal legal state of things that might not reflect what is in fact the case. Someone can be legally a convicted murderer without ever having actually killed somebody, or legally innocent, never having been convicted while in fact being guilty, which everybody might know it. That might be widely known, and of course God knows it. It's true before God that this person is guilty of the sin of murder, but never be convicted before the laws of the state. That is possible. So the point is that such a state of affairs is possible, and that, of course, that characterizes the state of affairs in a certain way. There's an application of those principles to the current situation in the church. I'm not going to get into all of that right now, but you know what I mean. So the bearing of the Holy Pontiff in the most trying circumstances shows a combination of gentleness, condescension, and firmness. That such a commotion and trouble were not followed by a lasting peace was no fault of the Holy Pope. But the ever-growing pretensions of the bishops of Constantinople, the weakness of Zeno, and the ambition of Acacius gave him no leisure to gather the fruits of his zeal and prudence, not on this earth anyway. The firmness displayed in opposing the attempts of Eastern heretics was also shown in the case of certain Western bishops. The Prelate of Ravenna had forcibly constrained the monk Gregory to accept the bishopric of Modena. The newly elected bishop complained to the Pope that he had been consecrated against his will. Simplicius most energetically remonstrated with the Bishop of Ravenna, forbidding him to perform any such consecration for the future, on pain of losing his metropolitan right over the churches of his province. So this is a fairly standard organization of things in the structure, the legal structures of the church. A province, an ecclesiastical province, over whom the metropolitan sits, and at least in a general sense. He has his own diocese, but he also has a certain power over the other bishops in his diocese who are in his province, who are bishops of their own dioceses. He has a certain authority over them and can make up for certain for defects of which they might be guilty, and so on and so forth. All that is regulated by the laws of the church. But they cannot certainly consecrate bishops and install them without the approval of the Pope. They cannot do that, most certainly not. And so you can see how the current discipline in the church has come into existence. Problems such as these arise. The Pope decided it's better we just don't let anybody else do it without direct authorization. And in fact, make them read the apostolic mandate during the ceremony of episcopal consecration, as is still required by the Roman Pontifical. In our times, though, it is still, of course, legitimate to consecrate bishops, but if you're doing it, don't write one to yourself. SSPX, they like to do that. That's what Archbishop Lefebvre had done. In 1988, they wrote that to let the apostolic mandate be read. The apostolic mandate means a mandate from the apostolic see, from the Pope, to consecrate this priest or bishop. And it has to be read during the ceremony, so everybody knows this is being done with the approval of the Pope. You cannot write it to yourself. You think you have a great reason to consecrate a bishop, and you might indeed. A bishop might have a good reason. You might have a very good reason to be there to assist in the ceremony. It doesn't mean you can write yourself a mandate. And they actually did that. And it sounds like a joke, but they actually did that. Saying we have a mandate from the Roman Catholic Church to do this for the survival, or however they put it, for the survival of the church and for the good of souls, in defiance of the man whom they insisted to be the Pope. He was the Pope. So that gives. There are quite a few jokes about that. They one of the things they said to JP2 in 1988. Well, the trains have been, special trains have been arranged in the tents because they do their ceremonies. That's another SSPX thing. They do their ceremonies in tents. Like to set up these huge tents outdoors, and they do ordination ceremonies there. So we rented those special tents and arranged special trains, so we have to do the ceremony. So imagine that, and the JP2 saying, "Oh, okay. In that case, go ahead." He didn't say that, and no real pope either would say that. So JP2, not even being a real pope, still did not go along with that. So that's just an absurdity, but that leads to all kinds of jokes. You set up a tent, you could consecrate a bishop. Lots of opportunities for jokes there. Okay, let's see. Moving on to, we don't have to go through all of the examples of everything that Saint Simplicius did during his pontificate. He was kept quite busy, clearly, though. Much of what he did exemplifies this very well, that it is the Pope and nobody else who has the plenitude of jurisdiction in the church. And nobody can do anything without his approval, ultimately, and not say that every little thing that anybody does ever has to be approved by him directly, but it all has to be done by his approval, everything authorized by, and we'll see this in the next pontificate that we're going to look at here, everything that is authorized by someone who is lower in the hierarchy of the church must also be done with his ultimate approval. That's why this is a regular thing in the daily, what we might even call the daily life of the church, that there are the bishops of dioceses every 5 years receive what were called the quinquennial faculties, the very name meaning ones that must be renewed every 5 years, as the very name indicates that, and received by the quinquennial faculties. Bishops were authorized themselves in turn to authorize various different things, such as actually the use of incense at a missa cantata. So a bishop had every 5 years had to have renewed, whatever the process exactly was. I don't know the details of it, but perhaps had to apply to the Holy See to have these faculties renewed every 5 years. And if he got that, as was routinely done, then he would be authorized to allow incense to be used at a missa cantata. So ultimately, the Pope authorized the use. If you had incense at a missa cantata at a parish church on a Sunday, then it was the Pope himself who was authorizing that. Maybe not, he didn't say, okay, this particular place, give me the name of the church or the chapel in this particular city, in this particular diocese, on this particular day, they can use incense there, but it all came down the chain of command, so to speak. Nothing was left to the imagination in the church. It was an amazing balance between everything being regulated, nothing being left to the imagination, and everything, but nothing being oppressive. Everything there was a perfect balance in the government of the church, with all of it done with exceedingly great wisdom. All the laws of the church, they were written with a different world in mind, so many of them we have to set aside in our situation today to provide for the good of souls, lest we fall into Phariseeism. We say that. We say what we say and act in accordance with that, because we need to avoid, for many reasons. One of them is avoiding Phariseeism, insistence on the letter of the law, excessive insistence upon it. We have to set aside the letter of the laws, but you can see even so that the letter of those laws, the exact provisions of them, are in fact very, very good. In a normal situation, they are excellent. Not to say that they could never be improved upon. They're the most perfect ever imaginable, but they are all very good. They are excellent, and must be always regarded with the greatest reverence. And we set them aside, as many of them we have to do in our situation. We still have to follow the spirit of them. Most definitely, we have to make constant reference to the laws of the church, to what was permitted, by the laws themselves, various permissions and so forth that were given. That's what we have to look to in order to form a good basis for judging how and when and why to apply epikeia, the principle of epikeia, under which we operate every single day, and even at this moment. So everything was very closely regulated in the church before Vatican II. And all of that, you can see, many centuries of experience informed all of those laws. Many centuries of experience went into formulating the exact ceremonies of the Roman Rite as they exist now. And by now, I mean, of course, according to the pre-55 rubrics. Many centuries of a very careful consideration went into formulating all of that. You can see when you say Mass or learn to say Mass, that you can see every little thing about the Mass is very carefully considered. Every little thing is arranged just as it should be. So, St. Simplicius to jealous, he says jealous to preserve the direct action, very jealous in a good sense, very desirous of protecting the power of the papacy, jealous to preserve the direct action of the papacy in the church as the source of all power and jurisdiction, appointed for the first time a primate for Spain in the person of the Bishop of Seville. This was a purely personal prerogative, which entailed upon a dignitary the care of seeing to the observance of the canons throughout Spain, under the direction of the sovereign pontiffs. So it is a divine institution that there be bishops in the church to assist the Pope in ruling the church, but it is not a divine institution that there must be, this diocese must exist, this particular place. I'm talking outside of Rome, the Holy See. Yes, there must be the first see in the church. That certainly always must be true, but there is no law that this or that city elsewhere in the world must have a diocese attached to it, that it must have a bishop, and that bishop has these prerogatives which the Holy See can do nothing to touch in any way. That is not the case. So popes can erect or shut down. They were never, in the history of the church, shutting down a diocese was something unheard of. But absolutely speaking, it's within the power of the Pope to do that, no question. No question on that score whatsoever. The popes could rearrange things as they saw fit, establish anyone to be the bishop of any place or not, as judged necessary for the good of souls, or to give special privileges to this or that diocese. Whatever the case might be, again, all with prudence, all for the good of souls, as we see in this case. Someone who is especially a bishop with special dignity given to him by the Pope to be the primate, the first, the first ecclesiastic in that country, the first in ecclesiastical things, the first member of the church, so to speak, in that country, to see to the general implementation of the laws in that place where the Pope himself cannot be personally to oversee it on his own. So the primacy of the See of Seville lasted to the celebration of the Second Council of Toledo, about 681 AD. So it lasted for a couple of hundred years. That was then rearranged by another Pope, as can be done. Okay, so we are now going to... It gives us some information about how that worked later on, but just interesting note, throughout the year 517, Pope Hormisdas gave nearly equal powers to John, Bishop of Tarragona. Yet this preeminence of the Bishop of Tarragona was but temporary, and the See of Seville soon again resumed the privilege of having for bishops the vicars or legates of the Holy See. So all of that is at the discretion of the Roman Pontiff. Nobody can make any demands upon him with regard to any of those things. St. Simplicius divided the alms of the faithful into 4 portions, the first for the bishop, second for the other clergy, the other 2 for the uses of the church, for pilgrims and the poor. This order was afterwards renewed in a positive manner by St. Gelasius I, by St. Gregory the Great, and by several other pontiffs. All right, so move on to, we have a few minutes left, to move on to the pontificate of St. Felix III. And notice an asterisk there, footnote at the bottom. This pope is usually styled Felix III in the catalogue of the sovereign pontiffs, and we have kept the title. We have seen that before the death of Pope Liberius, a pontiff who assumed the title of Felix II, officiated at Rome in the absence of the lawful pope. Some authors have asserted that Felix could lawfully exercise his ministry as Liberius' legate, and by his consent, and on the return of the latter, he retired into private life, deserved the honors of canonization. But we do not think that Felix II could possibly be lawful pope. In fact, it seems he was actually rejected. This Felix was rejected by the Roman population as being a false pope, but somehow the numbers got mixed up, and so is this the one we're looking at right now, St. Felix III, is considered to be Felix III, even though, at least by Darius, he's listed as such due to some confusion. I'll have to check, but it may in fact be that in other listings he's listed as Felix II. I'll have to check that. So the Holy See remained vacant but 6 days on the death of Saint Simplicius. That's a fast turnaround from death of one pope to conclave to electing the next pope in 6 days. The clergy of the Roman Church assembled with the Senate and people in the Basilica of St. Peter to the election of a new pope. During the preliminary proceedings, the patrician Basil, prefect of the Praetorium, in the name of Odoacer, king of the Heruli, protested that his master claimed the right of regulating the acts of the assembly and of confirming by his consent the election it made. Such a claim was not received. So any such claim, and it's not inconceivable that some civil ruler somewhere might have something to say about the conclave, might even be required to confirm it. We'll see that later on, that we're long before the time of the Holy Roman Emperors here, still centuries before. We won't see them until next year at least. But at a certain point, it was actually the Pope himself decided that in order for the conclave to be validly concluded, the emperor has to come to Rome and assess the situation, make sure there was no undue pressure exerted on the conclave, and to sign off on it, only thereupon the conclave being having validly produced a candidate for the papacy. But all of that is by the laws of the church, which can alone be instituted or changed by the Roman pontiff. And so at this time, no pope has given any such privilege to anybody. Definitely not to the king of the Heruli. Odoacer is not given any such privilege. So the document was canonically examined only 20 years later in a council of Rome, when it was decided that the election of the Roman pontiff was altogether foreign to the jurisdiction of the kings of Italy. No surprise there. Basil's communication failed in producing the effect looked for by Odoacer, and without regard to his claims, the assembly elected, we're calling him Pope Felix III for now at least, a native of Rome and priest of the title of Fasciola. The new pontiff owed his first thoughts to the Eastern Church. In other words, that's where attention was demanded yet again. But generally speaking, it's the problem child of the family gets all the attention. So at this point, the popes have to take care of the problem child of the church, which is the East. Notice that we have some mentions of the West, but it's, oh, by the way, this or that is happening in France or Spain. It's all interesting things to note, but the fake focus is on the East, where all the trouble is. And that's, to a great extent, that's a study of church history, study of the problems in the history of the church. There are many things that have happened in the history of the church. Really, we're studying here history generally, with special attention being paid to the trials and tribulations that the church has undergone, using the reigns of popes as general ways of using that as the through line in various periods. Things that most directly affect the reign of this or that pope, the things that we consider the most closely. And ultimately, studying history is studying history. And we can cover neither everything in the history of either the world in general, nor specifically the history of the church at any one time. We're looking here at all of the main points. That is what we have to do. The more information you have in any one period, the more you have to pick and choose what to focus on. Because there's just, when you get into it, especially in more recent times, there's just so much information available that you could spend a lifetime studying really any of these periods of church history that we look at. But we have to cover all of the main points and all of them, once again, for apologetic purposes to a great extent. There are multiple ends to be attained in studying the history of the church. And one of the ones that top the list is apologetics, answering a correct understanding of these events so as to be able to correctly explain them to people who, due to a misunderstanding of them, might formulate attacks on the church. Okay. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti sub tuum praesidium confugimus Sancti Dei Genitrix nostra supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus sera periculis contis libera nos semper precaudios et benedicta. Amen. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.